Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están todos ustedes? Este es el programa Encuentros del Futuro, el programa de entrevistas del Congreso Futuro de esta edición del año 2019. Con nosotros tenemos a dos importantes invitados, a la profesora Carol Mundell y al profesor Michael Kosterlitz. Carol Mundell, she's a PhD in astrophysics of Manchester University and professor of extragalactic astronomy and head of the Department of Physics. And also she's a chief scientific advisor of Foreign Commonwealth Office. Is that correct?
Correct. I'm head of astrophysics.
Okay. Perfect. And Professor Michael Kosterlitz, who is PhD in physics of Oxford University, a Nobel Prize in 2016 for topological phase transition and topological phase of matter. Is that correct, Professor? Kind of correct?
Yes.
Okay. I will open the conversation for both of you, and I would like to ask you how science make our life better. Any of you who wants to answer this?
I think it's a great question. I think science is a very fundamentally human thing to do. Humans have always explored their environment. They've always pushed the frontiers, whether it's ancient cave dwellers studying the cosmos and making cave paintings of the cosmos that they see around them, right through to the cutting edge technology that we have today. I think when we look at medical advances and how we actually improve people's lives and how we understand the world around us, it's actually really fundamental. Whether we, as Michael and I both work on fundamental physics questions, so we work on curiosity-driven research, but then we see how those apply right through to modern life, maybe over a very long time scale. It may not be immediately that year when you make a discovery that it has its applications. You think of Einstein's theory of general relativity. We now use that for our satellite navigation systems. Many people have these devices in their cars to tell them how to get to their destinations, and in fact it's because of the understanding of the nature of space-time that we're able to do that accurately, but that's 100 years before we realize that technology.
Great. And you, Professor, do you think does science make our life better?
Well, I think it does. Many people may disagree, but one of the earliest examples of how science made our life better was the invention of the steam engine, which allowed people to be transported reasonably quickly over large distances and goods transported and so on and so forth. And the steam engine, the science of thermodynamics was evolved to understand how to make steam engines as efficient as possible. So the applications and the theory go hand in hand again. There are plenty of other examples. Even the internal combustion engine for automobiles and things, that is based on, you can argue that is a thermodynamic system as well. What's the magic name for autocycle or something? And then, of course, there are more sophisticated things, as Carol said, the invention of cell phones. Our present society, if cell phones disappeared or stopped working, our present society would probably have problems in surviving. So science, I would say that science makes our lives better in many ways. Some people may argue to the contrary, because
but most think it does.
Well, yeah, but you see, to keep these scientific devices going, you need to understand at least a little bit about them. If you gave, say, a bunch of cell phones to a really primitive society, I don't think that they would help. That would help them very much to improve. But given the science at the right level, it can improve one's life a lot.
I think also it's the kind of the evolution of the questions that we're asking. So if we look at the revolution in human health, when antibiotics, the understanding of bacteria,
Yeah,
antibiotics came along, and if you think just as recently as the 1940s that we didn't have that kind of medical advance, that was just coming in our, being able to use those medicines. Now, of course, globally we have a growing problem with antimicrobial resistance. So if you can imagine having a life-threatening bacterial infection and medicines no longer working for that. So I think science goes in leaps and bounds, and then we now need new breakthroughs. We also have to look at our human practices, how we travel, how we do farming. All of those things come together to create a new problem that scientists then need to come back and tackle again almost in a different way. So it's not just a straight line from sort of primitive to progress. It's a constant dance of learning where those new frontiers and redefining them again.
Yes.
Well, with the antibiotic problem, I think that has come about because there wasn't enough education in the use of antibiotics, because the practice of using antibiotics in agriculture, for instance, and basically filling your animals with antibiotics, that was just crazy, because it just led to antibiotic-resistant bugs, and there are some very, very nasty ones around now.
And I think that's a really important point, that when we talk about science, it also is embedded in society, so that the breadth of social science, of psychology, and actually society's involvement in ethical frameworks. So just because we can do something scientifically, should we? Scientists shouldn't actually work in isolation. We need scientists working at the frontiers, but that sits within a wider societal framework and those value decisions to make, really.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to take you another subject. Professor Kosterlitz, how important for you it is the curiosity-driven science?
I'm sorry?
The curiosity-driven science. The curiosity.
Well, I think it's absolutely vital, because most of the important discoveries have come from curiosity-driven research. If we were to only do outcome-driven research, we wouldn't have discovered all sorts of things. And it is becoming a problem, especially in the US, with the funding, because your NSF or whatever proposal has to basically say what's going to come out of the research that you're asking money for. And of course, if you know what the outcome is going to be, in my opinion, it's not research anymore.
So you?
Yeah, I think curiosity-driven research is incredibly important, and I think it's almost like planting seeds. So you want to make sure that the brightest people have the right environments to be able to pursue those curiosity-driven questions, and also to formulate those questions. And I think it's the whole ecosystem around how you do that. But then, of course, taking that research to the next level, it may not be that scientist, it may be some other group. We're both physicists by training, so we may do something very abstract and esoteric. It may be an engineer who then says, oh, I would like to use that in some other way. And then ultimately how you then bring that through to business, and that can drive your economy. That's then a positive feedback loop, that you grow your economy based on that innovation, and it gives you the funds to be able to invest back into that fundamental science again. And also it might happen over very different timescales. It may be that the fundamental curiosity-driven research that you invest in now, you realize those benefits for society 10, 20, 50, maybe 100 years down the line, and you don't know which bit of curiosity-driven research is going to give you those big wins. So you plant all those seeds, you cultivate them, and then you get your big crops at the end.
Before this conversation, we also talk about how important it is to communicate to the children, to the kids. What is the biggest challenge in order to teach them science, and how important is that, both?
I think the biggest challenge is being able to answer all their questions as quickly as they want to ask them. I mean, my experience of working with very young children, I guess, from the age of sort of 3 all the way up, and they're completely uninhibited in the questions they ask. And certainly as an astrophysicist, they ask me the hardest questions. It's the youngest children that ask the hardest questions. The challenge that I've seen certainly through the education systems that I've had experience of is keeping either that interest or the confidence in the students that it's great to continue to study particularly the physical sciences. So in the UK, and this is a particular problem around encouraging girls to continue to study physics and maths and take engineering later on in their careers. There's been much work done, particularly with the Institute of Physics, about where biases come in. And why it tends to be boys that will take those subjects and the girls will choose other things. So lots of work around trying to make sure that we have that diversity of people coming through. It can be something as simple as the toys that children play with. There's a campaign called Let Toys Be Toys. So let's not gender toys, the girls' toys and boys' toys, they're toys. And creativity and curiosity, enabling children to keep that, because that's actually what makes the best scientists.
And you, Professor, have you had the opportunity to teach the kids?
I mean, I'm very much the same opinion, because when I was a kid, I loved maths and science, and I hated and despised things like literature, languages, history, geography, simply because my memory wasn't good enough. I couldn't cope with those subjects because there was too much memory involved. Whereas in the sciences, particularly maths and physics, I could get by on the facts my brain could hold, which is rather few.
And how important was the professor in that process? Was that important?
Not really, actually, because I basically just loved the subject. And I remember the first school I went to, the guy teaching us, I can't remember which professor it was, but I was listening to him talk, and I thought, he's got it all wrong. It's nonsense what he's saying. But it was just illogical. And unfortunately, I had the temerity to challenge him publicly in class, and I got smacked down very hard. So I didn't do it again, and just sort of ignored the idiocies he was saying. But it was a bit unfortunate but it still didn't put me off the science. I simply studied it on my own, and thought, okay, this teacher just doesn't understand the subject. So.
Thank you, Professor.
Right.
We're going to have to go to the break, and let's talk to the conversation soon, very soon.
Okay.
Gracias. Nos vemos después del break. Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos de nuevo. Vamos a seguir nuestra conversación con los expertos del día de hoy. Professor Mundell, I have been informed that you are an expert in gamma-ray bursts. Is that true?
It's true.
That's true. Recently was discovered an interesting phenomenon called the radio burst. What is the connection between these two phenomena?
So one connection is the way we discover things in science. Gamma-ray bursts were discovered by military satellites in the late 1960s, early 70s, and they were actually monitoring the Earth for signals of violations of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of the day. And the way those violations would be detected would be instantaneous flashes of high-energy gamma rays in the detectors. And the scientists around the time found these flashes, but very quickly, fortunately, realized that they weren't terrestrial, they were actually coming from space. And that was really where the birth of that field then came. One of the challenges that astrophysicists had, though, was that the accuracy of the positions from where these flashes occurred on the sky was very inaccurate. So, of course, if you say to anybody who has a telescope, go out into the back garden, you have maybe a second to look up in the sky with your telescope and find a visible counterpart to one of these flashes, and I won't be able to tell you really where in the sky it is. Go look. That's almost impossible. So the field languished for about 40 years until we had a new generation of technology, a high-energy X-ray satellite that was able to pinpoint the X-ray light from these new black holes, actually we now then for black holes formed in the distant universe. And so technology really marches on, particularly in astrophysics. You need to be able to localize something in the sky. We need to be able to capture visible light, and then we do what's called measure a spectrum. And this is actually looking at the light cut into tiny little fragments across the wavelength regime to try to measure the distance to the object, and then we can figure out where it is, if it's in our own atmosphere, if it's in the Milky Way, if it's in the distant cosmos. Fast radio bursts, which you talk about, were discovered again serendipitously back in 1997. Radio astronomers who were studying dense neutron stars, so these are the endpoints of stars that collapse. The material is very, very dense, so one sugar cube of neutron star material would weigh about the same as a medium-sized mountain, all crushed together in this dense heart of a star. They spin very quickly, they have magnetic fields, and when their beam passes the Earth, you get a blip in the radio spectrum. And so the scientists had this very special equipment that was measuring, looking for these pulsars. And a scientist called Duncan Lorimer, actually at Jodrell Bank Observatory using the Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia, found what would be called a bit like an atmospheric whistler. So it was a very short-lived flash of very bright radio waves that just lasted for a fraction of a second. So of course it was very difficult, and as yet we haven't yet been able to find the simultaneous counterparts to these at any other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And what the radio astronomers were able to do with that signal, they were actually able to measure or infer a distance, because these radio waves come through material and it changes the nature of the signal. And so with some guesses and some theory, they were able to figure out the length of the path through which these radio waves have come. Many more have been discovered, and in fact new detectors that are now being put on radio telescopes around the world are starting to find many more of these things. And the idea is that we think they exist either in very dense regions in our Milky Way. Some people think that. Most astronomers are convinced that they actually like cosmological distances. So we don't know what produces them. There have been some suggestions they're alien civilizations. I think most of us think that there's no evidence for that yet. So I think most of my colleagues are saying it's not aliens. I'm still saying it's not aliens. We have no scientific evidence for that. It's a nice idea. But yeah, probably very, very energetic processes. So the race is on. We're all trying to use our robotic telescopes around the world to catch other signatures of these fast radio bursts. So it's a very exciting time to be in astrophysics.
It sounds great. Yeah. Professor Kosterlitz, you are worldwide known because of a sentence called exotic matter.
Sorry?
Exotic matter.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that. Think that now I'm a kid of 6 years old. Try to think of that and what we can do with that. Well, 7 if you want.
I don't think there's much you can do with it.
But I can try to understand.
Because, sorry to go a bit technical here, but I think I have to. The point is that I'm interested in what goes on in two spatial dimensions.
Okay.
I imagine myself living in a two-dimensional world. Oops. In this case, you can ask yourself what sort of structures can exist in this two-dimensional world. A crystal, for example, in 3 dimensions is you have a set of atoms on some 3-dimensional lattice. In 2 dimensions, the 2-dimensional crystal would form some regular pattern in flatland. And you can ask about the properties of this 2-dimensional crystal. Well, the first property is that the conventional idea of a crystal is that if I know where one atom is, I know where all the others are, because there's a nice regular periodic pattern, and the atoms are, out in this nice periodic pattern. So you know where one particle is, you know where all the others are. In 2 dimensions, that is only half true because of thermal fluctuations, in that because the displacement from the ideal position of the atom, if you ask the question, okay, I've got 2 atoms which in the ideal crystal would be some distance apart, what will they be, where will they be when you've got thermal, at finite temperature, thermal effects, and you discover that the displacement from its zero temperature position, or equilibrium position if you wish, grows, increases logarithmically with the size of the system, so that for the large system, the displacement of the atom from its equilibrium position is basically infinite. So at which point you say, okay, crystal doesn't exist in 2 dimensions. Then you look at it a bit further and you discover that some of the aspects of a crystal will still work in 2 dimensions, as for example, the crystal axis. If you have a triangular crystal, you'll have 6 crystal axes, 60 degrees, 60 degrees apart, and you can ask, what about the orientation of these crystal axes, due to thermal fluctuation? And you find that in 3 dimensions, that would be basically fixed. I mean, no deviation due to temperature. But in 2 dimensions, the deviations are large, and you get these logarithmic divergences again. So again, you'd say the crystal doesn't really exist. But it's still this structure, although you can't really call it a crystal, still has all the other properties of a crystal, like it's got finite elastic constants, as in rigidity and compressibility, just like a normal crystal. It's still perfectly well defined and non-zero, so that you could say that these are the defining characteristics of a crystal.
Okay.
So, as I said, it depends on what property of the material you look at in 2 dimensions. In some aspects, it looks just like a 3-dimensional version. In other aspects, it looks very different. And so it's an interesting world.
It is absolutely interesting. This is the type of things that someone can make a Nobel Prize.
Well, yeah, but it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting system to sort of try to figure out what's going on.
Okay. So I think all of us are very aware about how important it is to the governments know that science is important. But for us, it's also important to, struggle a little bit with them in order to make them know that to put some funds on that. Professor, you are a counselor in United Kingdom. How do you think that we should do? We should try to push our government, our president, and all the people here in order to put some more money in these type of researches.
So in my experience, actually, both in the UK and Chile, there's real recognition in our governments that science and investment in science and technology and then the pull through into innovation is actually critically important. In the UK, our Prime Minister announced a new industry strategy. She actually made that announcement at one of our national labs. She's since been back and made other announcements, actually at Jodrell Bank Observatory, where I did my PhD, with the giant radio telescope behind her. And so I'm very heartened by that recognition at the heart of government that not only is scientific research and those pursuits important, but in my role as scientific advisor, that actually bringing the best science-based evidence into policy making and to inform policy making is very important. Politics actually is dealt with by politicians, but that recognition that making sure that decisions are challenged and informed by the best scientific evidence is one of the roles that I play there. And my visit to Chile, apart from having the pleasure to speak at the Futures Congress, is also that involvement with ministers here in Chile to continue to build really strong collaborations that have been there for some time between our 2 countries, where academics and researchers work at that very scientist to scientist level, but actually making sure that the structures are in place to enable scientists to continue to do the best work that they can for the benefit of their countries.
Thanks. And you, Professor, what do you think? What kind of advice you can give us in order to make our politics fall in love with science?
Well, I was going to ask Carol a question, but don't you think the fundamental problem is the education system? Because most of the teachers don't understand science, so they can't teach it.
Yeah, I think it's really important sort of what you define as science. So there's obviously the fundamentals of the frontiers of scientific research that you might think in your universities and your research institutes. I think how we feed back, as we've been talking about in this conversation, that passion, that you ignite that or you continue to support that in children. I think that's really important. Their families also, you know, helping parents and families understand the opportunities that there are for children through their careers. And I think also the education system to enable and support, not necessarily to educate everybody to become scientists, but actually to help people become scientifically literate. Because as I was saying before, when scientists do their cutting edge research, those conversations about how we use that research has to be held in society, whether that's in your governments or whether that's in your communities.
Let me give you a parallel. I mean, every child at school is expected to learn a language. Another language, like, you know, most French or whatever. Why shouldn't every kid be expected to learn some basic science?
So I think children
make it just part of the essential, the required curriculum.
It's my understanding in many countries that is the case. I think one of the problems I've seen with working with schools is to how to keep the real passion. There's something about saying it's compulsory that you do this. It's very different saying well, you can do this and love it while you're doing it. So I think it's both of those, actually supporting teachers so that they have the toolkits that gives them the confidence to basically engage with exciting science.
Well, of course, that's essential,
yeah.
that the teachers are understand enough about the science that they're able to teach it.
We should have
with enthusiasm.
this conversation for the homework in order to make our politics fall in love with this. I would like to say thank you to both of you. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes por escuchar esta conversación. Gracias.